Okay, so let's talk about the next step. That is make a production chart for all assets. Now, this is something that I'm sure every studio and every group does a little bit differently, but I developed my own over the years that we use whenever we have a big production to do with the whole team. And we used to draw this up on the inside the studio on the whiteboard. And that's kind of why when I found this real-time board thing, I thought it was super cool because you could draw things on here, and this is something that's you can add notes and things like that really easy. I maybe I'll have to do a separate video on how to use this real-time board because it's super cool. So this kind of takes the place of having a big whiteboard in the studio, and it's a lot more efficient because you can add more things. The only drag, of course, is it's not there in the studio and not everybody can look at it at the same time. So then it becomes more of a discipline to get people to come back here and look at it. And that's something that we should probably work on in the studio to make sure everybody has a link for this. And uh, uh, it just helps because sometimes they want to know what to do next. And the answer is usually right here. But then again, local project management, like having somebody there, is part of what makes that work is to have somebody there to remind them to look on the board or to look on the board yourself and say, okay, because it's easy to forget. There's a lot of things happening. So this kind of wasn't something I just kind of invented, out of nothing. It's something that we developed over, the last few years as we were working. It really helped us to kind of structure everything and see um, what we have to do and who's going to work on it, and we would usually have a time, also, like, for example, we got this couple of projects like this, but one in particular was this uh, cockpit, a cockpit, airplane cockpit, and that was really complicated, and we had a lot of things to get done. And having the big whiteboard in the studio was real helpful to look up at it every day and go, okay, well, what are we doing? The next couple of days, what do we got to adjust? What do we got to fix? What do we got to get done by a certain time? And it just was really helpful. So I found that this is a valuable tool for production. So now to recap, once we've gotten our strip boards done, now we kind of have to make a schedule or plot out the plan. And this is where it kind of departs a little bit from film production, although there are a lot of similarities. Particularly in film production, let's say if you have to build a lot of props and prepare scenes, sets, or even build sets and stuff like that, you would probably have some kind of a production board like this. If you're just shooting in available scenes, and it might be a little bit different. So the way this uh, production board works, I mean, you already have the template here to use. You don't have to make another one of these. These can be edited. They can be moved around. Um, the colors can be changed here and so on, and text can be written inside there like that, right? So, that, oops, put it back to caps. So, right, and then like I usually use yellow for in progress, green for done, so on and so forth. And there's a place to put the artist's name here so we know who's working on what, right? And so let me go down here to where I set it up for one of these. That was a good example. I think maybe it was this one, this Dr. Lakis one. Yeah, so this is probably a pretty good one. So when we talk about the overall production for animation, and in this case, we're not going to use Unreal for this short film. We're going to use Cycles. So this was kind of more specific to exporting it to Unreal and getting it set up in there. In this case, we'll already be in Blender, probably using Eevee and Cycles. I could probably add that here. Would be Eevee and Cycles. Oops, let's capitalize that. Eevee. something like that. It's kind of how it's spelled. EV cycles. Okay. Too many E's. Only so many E's. All right. So EV is that real-time renderer, and the shaders are used in cycles, right? So it's kind of the materials and cycles are kind of the same thing, except that now we're talking about lights and setting up a scene and getting the model ready to be rendered and do some test rendering on it. Getting it ready for the render pipeline. All right. So going back down the pipeline, obviously we need concept art before we can sculpt the model, and we need that before we can re-topo, before we can re-UV textures, materials, and so on. This is a really helpful process, I think, to look at all this and see the sequence, and then as we go down the sequence, we say done, and it helps us track what's happening with everything. So regarding these two branches, I have graphics pipeline and animation branch. So what do I mean by that is basically as we are creating the higher poly model, and you've seen this in the studio already with what Nut has been doing with all of the models, he's taking these and making these low polygon approximations of it, right? So let me see if I can grab that just for the sake of illustration. So I can grab that right one. There we go. So these ones that he's making here, right? He made it for, made it for the bot, for the insect bot, and there we go. There's a mystic, right? So the idea is here, just to put the visual there, is that we have the low polygon model that is a representation of the higher polygon one that we can start animating very quickly, and also with low overhead for the animation side, and that's really helpful, right? So back to this other one that shows the actual board, not that one. There we go. So we have two parallel productions happening at the same time. We have the high polygon asset being created, and then we have setups for animation being done. And so we can actually animate starting all the way back here as soon as Pi is done with the rigging, right? So Nut would make a low polygon model, Pi gets it rigged, and now we can animate it. Okay, and so the animation goes into shots. So we'll have a shot list at some point after the storyboard is done, and that will be like me or Nick or both of us working on the shots, and then which in turn goes to the render pipeline. In other words, in this case, it'll be EV and cycles. But you see, this is kind of a separate end of the production. This right here, this section right here. It requires, at the very minimum, we have a low polygon character to animate with, and then so that we can now start making some shots, and then we can render it, and then we're into post-production. Now, this can happen it can happen in a high polygon version and a low polygon version. So we can have an animatic in the low polygon version, and the high polygon version is the final render, right? So we can actually go through this twice. One with a low polygon and one with the final render. And that is exactly what we will do. So this whole sequence from here to here happens 2 times, right? And it saves time overall because we can catch things that we need to fix and change with the low polygon stuff before we get the higher quality stuff and start rendering forever. Okay, so that's the way that works. So we got these 2 parallel pipelines going. So what happens is at some point, even though the animator will be using the low polygon asset to animate sooner, the asset is continuing through the pipeline in this direction. And as it gets the UV and textures, at some point, I've determined that pretty much right here is the most efficient time to say that now we're going to take the model and send it to the rigger guy, and now we have to take and copy the rigging that he did over to the ones with the materials and the textures and all that, and then he passes it back to the guy for EV cycles, right? So that it can then be passed over to the render pipeline. And then it gets passed to the animator, who now then transfers the animations to the high polygon model and sends it up through the shots and the render pipeline. You see, they both kind of converge at the same place here, right? It's kind of more like what happens is this kind of gets passed up to here, and this kind of gets passed back to here. However you want to look at it, really. But another way to look at it is once this gets passed to here, it goes through this process and through this, and at some point, this guy will grab it before it goes to the final render and make sure that these scenes are set up. A lot of ways to look at it. But basically, the main thing is that as the asset is going through the pipeline, it can change and will change from low polygon to the final version. And this is happening, this will happen a lot faster than all of this. So we jump to here, right? And then we move on up through the production. That's how that works. Okay, so now because you can edit these, you can double click on them and change names. You won't have to change any of this, but you can see all of these are with the Unreal setup. We'll probably just change those names to EV cycles. But you can, the reason I put these here was that these are potential places where we could send back the mesh to Pi or whoever's doing the rigging, right? But I think the ideal point to do that is just to do it once at materials, and then we just wait until we get all that done up here. But we could pass it along on these different phases here. It could happen. So that's why that's written that way. But then you can change the colors. You can write, done, finished, done, in progress, and leave it gray for something that isn't done yet, right? That's why that's how that works. And then the artist name, that can be changed. So other things you can use to build this with is, let's see, where did that go? Oh, I didn't copy it over to here, but I have it on the other production board. Let me show you that. So here, there we go. So over here we have, where is it? There should be a little, oh yeah, up here. There we go. So we have these color-coded names of all the artists in the studio, right, that we can use to copy and paste over to the production board to give a name to who's doing what, and they can be made longer and smaller and so on and so forth. I'll probably do another video showing you how to use these tools over here to edit these and work on these. And so the concept art, that can be put in there. If we don't have concept art yet, we just leave that blank, which will be the case for this because we'll start off with no concept art, but as soon as we get it, we'll put it in there. Okay, so that's that. And then back to this one. Okay, so let's review this again. So we got make a production chart for all the assets, right? So that would be all the assets. And then we can follow the sequence of these assets with this sequence that we've made up in this earlier step with organize the strip boards into a logical production sequence. So we'd have a sequence that we were doing these, as well as there may be some that are happening at the same time, right? That we have more people working on this. We might have, somebody working on 2 different characters or a set, 2 different sets happening at the same time. Or let's say a character, a set, and some props, right? Depending on how we split it up. But we set the priority first so that we know what needs to be done first. That the sooner we get the final things we need, all the things that we need for one scene, the sooner we do that, the sooner we can move to this render pipeline here and actually get to post-production, getting shots finished, right? So it's a long process. And we don't want to wait till the very end to render everything. That would be silly, right? So we'll be rendering things all the way through the process as soon as we can get enough things done on the first scene to start rendering. So that's the basics of that.